81A Mill Road, an address that for decades struck dread into the hearts of countless people, yet which later represented a place of joy at the arrival of new life, and is now a community home offering rest and comfort to the elderly. Long before it acquired an address, it sat surrounded by fields, a mile away from the centre of Cambridge, far removed from academic life and commercial life. Built in 1838, it was the Cambridge Union Workhouse. Why Union? Until the 1830s, the responsibility for feeding and caring for the poor lay with the parishes of the Church of England, each of which had its own poorhouse. When this became a burden too great for individual parishes, the government in 1834 passed a new law encouraging parishes to join together to build larger union workhouses. The parishes had to contribute money each year for the running of the place, which was overseen by a committee called the Board of Guardians, made up of representatives from all the parishes. And this committee was in turn overseen from Whitehall by the Poor Law Commissioners. Here's the design of the original frontage. Why did I say dread a moment ago? To enter the workhouse was to be stigmatized for life. You were considered idle, indolent, work-shy by the rest of the community. What's more, life in the workhouse was wretchedly hard, with rigorous conditions, inadequate food, and a regime of labour and punishments. If a family came to the workhouse door, a family that, through no fault of its own, very often could no longer support itself because of illness, disability, or impoverishment, and I should say the 1840s saw most terrible economic depression with mass unemployment, as well as outbreaks of cholera, and that's something we can sympathise with, particularly in 2020, isn't it? That family was immediately split up into men, women, boys, and girls. And then, in turn, the men and women were split into able-bodied and infirm, which is to say sick, living in 6 different parts of the building and not allowed to communicate on pain of punishment. In this plan of the front area, you can see the separate spaces for the elderly and infirm men on the left and for the women on the right. And here, in the middle of the site, are the areas for boys and girls, each with its own schoolroom at the side, and privies, toilets, sick room, and sleeping area. And this is the rear of the site for the able-bodied, with their own dining rooms and other facilities. On the far left are the stone room and the mill room, where men were put to forced labour breaking up stones or walking a treadmill. And on the far right were the laundry room and the wash house, where the women similarly laboured all day. This is the layout of the whole site, with the elderly and sick at the bottom of the plan, the children in the middle, and the able-bodied at the top. Very little of the original building now survives, only the frontage. Of the 3 other workhouses in the region, Caxton, Linton, and Saffron Walden, only that of Linton survives intact, and very handsome it is too. The chief visual difference from Cambridge is that the main buildings are all in red brick. This building is now a private nursing home for the elderly, so it's not open to the public. The layout of the site is very close to that of Cambridge, with 6 courts. At the very centre, there is a 2-storey building, the living quarters of the 2 people who ran the workhouse. The Cambridge living quarters were demolished long ago, but here is the Linton one. Now, every Union workhouse was run by a married couple, with the titles of master and matron. Their first floor rooms gave them an all-round view of activity in all courts. And here is the plan of the corresponding quarters in Cambridge. You see the middle of that plan. The plan calls the master the governor, incorrectly, of course. The master had overall control and particular concern for the male population, while the matron was in charge of all the females and also of matters to do with health and food. To support her, there was a nurse, and there was also a school mistress and a school master. 5 members of staff. All other functions had to be carried out by the inmates themselves. 2 of these couples stand out particularly in the history of the Cambridge Workhouse. The first were Luke Hosegood from South Devon and his wife Emma. She is seen here in a photograph with the nurse and male inmates. And they were in charge for 37 years, from 1876 all the way through to 1913. They were much loved, unlike many of the masters and matrons, I can say. Luke's reputation was sealed when fire broke out in the men's infirmary at 3 a.m. in 1883. And he courageously climbed up a ladder and through a window amid smoke and falling plaster to carry out an elderly patient. In the late 1920s, the government passed bills in Parliament abolishing the entire workhouse system. And after several changes of name, by 1934, the Cambridge Workhouse became the Cambridge County Infirmary. In that year, 1934, 2 people whose names were to be indelibly associated with the place were appointed master and matron, posts they held for 22 years, retiring in 1956. Douglas and Doris Ditchburn. How did an infirmary differ from a hospital? And in particular, how did the county infirmary differ from Addenbrooke's, which had been founded long ago in 1766? The answer is a hospital was curative, whereas an infirmary was for the incurable, for the senile, the terminally sick, the mentally ill, and the incurably hypochondriac. Moreover, Addenbrooke's was a private hospital where patients had to pay some of their costs, whereas the infirmary was a state institution run by local authorities. So one big difference between workhouse and infirmary was the cessation of the brutal punishment regime, the floggings, the solitary confinements, the starvations, and the futile hard labour. Another difference was the structure. Instead of 6 areas, the infirmary was, like a hospital, organised by wards. It was made up of infectious wards, lunatic wards, maternity wards, nurseries, and wards for other types of illnesses. But it was not all that different. Still, in the early 1930s, it had wards for the over 70s. And many inmates were still sent to it for what was called institutional relief, which was a hangover from the old poor law days. Mostly adults, but also children and infants. In short, despite many important changes, there was still a lot of the workhouse about the infirmary. It is at this point, in 1935, that 2 new buildings were erected on the site, changing the entire appearance of the Mill Road frontage. Both buildings were designed in a modernist European style by the architect who designed the Bottisham and Linton village colleges, S.E. Urwin. The first was the 3-storey block at the left-hand side of the site. This was the new nurses' home. The other, at the right-hand end, was a house in which the Ditchburns were to live, the master's house. But it was all change in September 1939, with the outbreak of World War II. First, busloads of people started arriving from London, where hospitals, fearing German bombing raids, cleared their long-term patients to make room for thousands of expected casualties. They came from Whipps Cross Hospital, from Mile End, from Queen Mary, and from many other hospitals in the East End of the city. A lot of their surnames were German or East European. The registers of admissions give the religion of many of these as Hebrew, which is to say Jewish. Immigrants who had escaped from the Polish pogroms and the Nazi Nuremberg laws. Others came from the Essex and Suffolk coastal hospitals, where German landings were expected any day. And secondly, military casualties began arriving from the many anti-aircraft and bomber command stations in East Anglia, men being made fit to return to the battlefront. And in June 1940, Mill Road received casualties from the Dunkirk evacuation, rifles and all, as one writer put it. What's more, there were prisoner of war camps in the area, and sick captives from them started arriving in 1943, often with Italian surnames. In short, 81A Mill Road was transformed into a wartime emergency medical hospital. The old, dilapidated workhouse buildings had to be adapted. X-ray facilities and operating theatres had to be built, and staff were brought in with specialist skills, surgeons, anaesthetists, radiologists, all of whom had to be accommodated on the premises. And with all of these changes, Douglas and Doris at Ditchburn had to cope. The end of the war in 1945 saw the departure of all the military casualties, POWs and London hospital patients, and the County Council began to plan for a building up of maternity services at Mill Road. In 1946, the first batch of students arrived to study at its newly established midwifery training school, which was installed in the existing nurses' home. That was a major turning point in the history of the institution and a real feather in its cap. November 1946 saw the passing of the National Health Service Act, and the service itself came into being 18 months later. Thus, the name Maternity Hospital was granted in July 1948. At first, the hospital had only 91 maternity beds and 6 cots in a premature baby unit. But it had still not altogether shaken off the vestiges of the workhouse, for it also housed 2 wards accommodating 24 geriatric female cases, attended by a geriatrician. Not until 1965 was that unit finally moved away. Already by 1950, the number of births in the year reached 1,750, with 25 sets of twins and 2 of triplets. Those numbers rose year on year, and the midwifery students increased from 18 to 64 by the mid-1950s. Now, it's at this point in the narrative that some of my listeners will know about this institution from personal experience, whereas I can work only from archive records and memoirs. Some will have given birth on its wards, some will have worked there as nurses, doctors or porters, and many more will just know they were born there. The average stay for a normal delivery was then 14 days. Babies were nursed away from their mothers in separate nurseries and brought to the mother only for breastfeeding. Visiting by families was limited to 3 days a week. The regime was altogether strict. Some improvement of physical facilities on the site was carried out over the next 30 years. Buildings were adapted, or demolished and replaced. New units were introduced. But there came a point in the 1970s when it was agreed that the site had reached its limits and needed replacing by a facility better equipped for the latest medical practices in obstetrics, anaesthesia and radiology, and reflecting new social policies on home versus hospital deliveries. So a new maternity unit was planned on the Addenbrooke site, and a local benefactor, Mr. David Robinson, offered to provide funds if it were named in memory of his mother. The new unit, called, of course, the Rosie, was completed in September 1983, and Mill Road Hospital finally closed. In 1984, the County Council sold the site to the city with a view to building flats. In the 1980s, the city had its own brilliant team of architects, and they designed a model social housing scheme for the site. Douglas and Doris Ditchburn had taken retirement in 1956 after 22 years' tireless work, transforming a workhouse through the war years into a much-loved maternity hospital, The public remembered them with fondness, so it was decided that the new complex should bear their name. The architect's plan entailed demolishing all the rear buildings, preserving only the nurse's home, the master's house, the main 1838 front, and the east wing, which had been built in the 1960s. Of the front range, only the facade could be kept, since the rest of the fabric was hopelessly dilapidated. The architects planned a set of interlinked buildings offering sheltered housing, accommodation for younger people with disabilities, and extra care housing, which was novel for the time and afforded many people end-of-life care. The buildings were arranged around 4 courtyards connected to the older buildings. If you look carefully here, you can see on the left the new buildings, and at the centre back and the right portions of the older buildings linked by an archway. And here is one of the larger courtyards, the second, towards the back. At the rear of the site are several terraces of houses in modernised Victorian style, matching the surrounding housing stock of the area. This one even has a corner shop. These houses were available on the open market as flats for rent. Emphasis has always been on Ditchburn Place as a community, with a friendly atmosphere among residents, with a range of social activities, and with a staff, administrative, catering, carers, etc., who support it full-time, plus visiting nurses, doctors, and other agencies. Formerly run by the City Council through social services, it's now run by a care management company and is part of a citywide independent living service. Here you can see a panoramic view of the Mill Road frontage as it was in 2016. At the extreme left is the 1935 Nurses' Home, later the Midwifery School. To the right of the big bush is the original 1838 frontage. To the right of that, sticking forwards, is the East Wing, built in the 1960s, and on the far right is the Master's House, since then demolished. Ditchburn Place is the oldest surviving building on Mill Road. A recent attempt by the Mill Road History Society to have it listed Grade 2 failed on grounds that not enough of the original fabric survives. The Society believes that the 1935 building should have been considered, but instead the Art Deco Master's House was demolished in 2018 to extend the East Wing. Throughout its entire existence, the institution has been an organised community of one sort or another, with rules and disciplines. Until 1946, it was a community shut off from its surroundings. Today, it is open to the outside world, a community within a community. If you've enjoyed this short video and would like to read more about Ditchburn Place as workhouse, infirmary and emergency war hospital, do click on the first of the links given on this slide. If you'd like to see the work of Mill Road History Society displayed on the web, click on the second link given here, which will take you to the website Capturing Cambridge. And if you'd like to subscribe to the Society's newsletter and receive notifications of its events, do click on the third link.